Have you ever wondered what it would be like to look into Jesus' eyes, feeling that look that not even the Roman governor himself could forget? What did Pilate see in that face that the whole world tried to erase or shape for centuries? Something so impactful, so different, that not even official words from Rome could hide it. Now imagine, what if there was a secret letter, written by the same man who signed the sentence? A letter that describes not only Jesus' behavior, but every feature of his face, even the color of his eyes. What silent truth would be hidden between these forgotten lines? What light crossed the soul of a hardened politician and left him without peace until the end of his life? Stay until the end. Because what you're about to hear could shake everything the world thought it knew about the Son of God, and perhaps it will awaken something dormant inside, something that no historian or artist has managed to capture. For decades, archaeologists have scoured ruins and deserts for fragments that could fill in the gaps in ancient history. Incomplete maps, manuscripts hidden in caves, and statues buried under tons of sand served as pieces of a puzzle that seemed to have no end. But among all the finds already catalogued, few caused as much discomfort as the content of a letter that, according to some forgotten records, was written by a Roman governor in Jerusalem, a well-known man, mentioned in sacred texts and historical documents, but almost always treated as a supporting character in the narrative that marked the turn of the Western calendar. Pontius Pilate, Rome's direct representative in the empire's most unpredictable province. Subscribe so you don't miss investigations that reveal the hidden side of history. Here, every forgotten piece can change everything you thought you knew. What this letter carries, however, goes beyond the bureaucracy of a political report. The text is short, objective, and disturbing, not because of what he says openly, but because of the between the lines that escape each paragraph. Written with a mix of reverence and bewilderment, the letter describes a man he could not classify, a prisoner who didn't look like a prisoner, an accused who maintained the posture of a king, someone whose gaze, according to Pilate, brought a light that he could not explain. There was no cold language typical of Roman governors in his words. There was doubt, almost guilt. The content of this manuscript did not appear in public libraries, nor in official documents. It was cited by some monks in the past, hidden in difficult-to-access codices, ignored in councils and avoided for centuries. But still, he resisted. Copyists transcribed it in secret, crossing continents with pieces of parchment wrapped around, leather belts, or sewn into the folds of tunics. When some of these fragments reappeared in the private collections of noble families in northern Italy, the debate was immediate. Was it apocryphal like so many others, or was it the only description made by someone who looked into Jesus' eyes without being at his feet? In the text, Pilate does not offer a religious testimony. He does not call him the Messiah, nor does he identify him as a criminal. She refers to him as a man unlike any other. He states that his presence caused silence, that his voice was not imposed by volume but by authority. And in one of the most intriguing passages, he describes his physical features with unusual care. He says that his eyes had a color that ranged from honey to bronze, that his hair was dark, wavy, and went down to his shoulders, that his skin was slightly brown but without marks, as if the sun didn't dare burn that body. And even when he wore simple clothes, he carried a dignity that bothered the Pharisees and made the soldiers uneasy. Pilate writes that he had never seen a man so calm in the face of death, so confident even when surrounded by a crowd. He reports that he did not defend himself, he did not appeal, he did not accuse anyone. He just looked at him, and that in that look there was an inexplicable peace. The governor ends his report by saying that that execution was not a state decision, but a concession to fear. That guilt wouldn't let him sleep, as he had handed over an innocent man to death to save an unstable alliance. Their superiors demanded order. Local leaders demanded blood. He chose the path that avoided the uprising. But I knew deep down that that gesture would exact an invisible price. There is no mention of the name of Jesus directly in all parts of the text, but the identity of the man described fits precisely with the profile of the one who was tried and crucified at Easter in Jerusalem at the beginning of the 1st century after Christ. Even today, Historians are divided between those who treat the letter as a legend and those who see it as an attempt at a personal record of someone who participated, even against his will, in the most disruptive event of his time. A document that should never have come to light, but that insists on reappearing as an uncomfortable shadow in the world's memory. Pilate's face in traditional records is almost always that of a passive man who washes his hands and disappears into the shadow of history. However, when looking at the letter from the perspective of the person who wrote it, it is possible to perceive another portrait. A foreign politician surrounded by tensions that exceeded his ability to control. The city he ruled was not like the other provinces in the empire. Jerusalem pulsed with unstable energy, a place where faith moved the people more than laws, where symbols were more powerful than decrees, and where the Roman presence was tolerated, never accepted. Pilate was not a simple administrator. He was a trained soldier, educated in Roman culture and accustomed to resolving conflicts firmly. But he also knew that Jerusalem could not be treated as an ordinary city. Any mistake, any thoughtless gesture, could trigger a revolt that would require too much strength to contain. And at that specific moment, with the Easter festival bringing together crowds, the atmosphere was particularly volatile. Rome's eyes were on him. His mission was to maintain order at any cost. And so when faced with that man brought by the religious leaders, the first reaction was caution. The accusation was political, but the content was religious. Too dangerous terrain. The letter, at this point, reveals not only Pilate's perception of Jesus, but also the discomfort he felt with the entire process. He reports that he expected to find an agitator, a subversive. Instead, he saw someone who didn't beg, didn't justify himself, and stranger still, didn't seem to carry hatred. His presence created silence. Even the soldiers avoided facing him directly for a long time. Pilate describes a moment of hesitation where the man's look made him question whether he was facing something that went beyond the barriers of politics. It was as if that prisoner wasn't a prisoner in a suit, as if he were there of his own free will. The clash between Pilate and the religious leaders takes on a tone of subtle tension. They demand quick action. They say the man is dangerous, that he calls himself king. Pilate responds that he sees no crime. They insist. They say that if he doesn't act, he will be betraying Caesar. At this point, the governor begins to realize that he is not judging a man, but being manipulated into authorizing a convenient execution. Still, he tries alternatives. Mentions the tradition of freeing a prisoner. He offers Barabbas, a known rebel. The crowd chooses the criminal. Pilate doesn't understand. The letter at this point takes on a more personal, almost confessional tone. He wonders what led those people to reject a peaceful man in favor of a thief. This dilemma does not only appear in the Gospels, it resurfaces, in a disguised form, in writings that have escaped the censorship of the centuries. Pilate's psychological profile emerges as that of a man who saw too much and could do too little. Not because of inability, but because of fear of chaos. His empire was not sustained by justice, but by stability. And maintaining order for him meant giving in when it was safest to give in, even if it cost the life of someone who maybe wasn't just a man. There is an excerpt in the letter in which Pilate mentions wondering if that look belonged to someone ordinary. He said that when he heard the accused speak, he felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if those words touched an ancient part of his being. It wasn't conversion nor amazement, it was discomfort, an internal discomfort that he was unable to name, but which, as he himself writes, would accompany him until his final days. As the trial drew to a close, the pressure was unbearable. Pilate knew his role was to end the conflict before it got out of control. By offering water and washing his hands in front of the crowd, he was not just trying to absolve himself of blame. He was, in his own words, signing a pact with silence. He chose to survive at the cost of the truth. And although he tried to convince himself that he had acted according to protocol, his account shows that something inside him never really believed it. Jesus' gaze, as described by Pilate, was not accusatory. It was serene, as if he already knew the outcome, as if he expected exactly that result. And this was perhaps what disturbed the governor the most. Because in the face of so many who begged for leniency throughout his career, that man was the only one who asked for nothing. He just looked at him. And Pilate understood, even without admitting it out loud, that he was not in charge of that decision. It was just one more cog in a machine too old to be understood. Although many questioned the authenticity of the letter, the way it was preserved and the language used offer clues about its origin and the impact it has had over the centuries. Unlike the official records of Rome, which tended to be formal and impersonal, this text carries an unexpected emotional charge. The writing is sober but not cold. There is a concern with describing not only the events, but the sensations aroused. This raises the hypothesis that the author did not write to justify his actions, but to deal with them. As if the letter were less a report and more a belated outburst, addressed to someone he himself didn't know existed. The document, in its earliest versions, appears in vulgar Latin and Koine Greek, indicating that it was translated and adapted as it passed through the hands of scribes in different regions. There are excerpts that were changed, omitted or reinterpreted according to local contexts. In some copies, the name of Jesus appears with variations, being referred to only as the Nazarene or the one who called himself the Son of the Most High. In others, there are more explicit descriptions, such as the report of the crowd around the court and the coordinated screams demanding his death. The most debated part, however, is the one describing its appearance. Pilate dwells on physical details in a manner unusual for a Roman governor. He writes that his eyes seem to change color depending on the light, oscillating between shades of amber and copper. He says that his hair was dark, slightly wavy, and that his skin had a different glow as if it carried the reflection of something invisible. It does not describe him as beautiful in the classic sense of Greco-Roman aesthetics, but as someone impossible to ignore, a type of presence that didn't need words to dominate the space. This type of description challenges the traditional portraits that sacred art has established over the centuries. During the Middle Ages, the image of Jesus was standardized according to European standards, with fair skin, blue eyes, and delicate features. Pilate's letter, on the contrary, suggests a man with features typical of the Middle East at the time, which coincides with archaeological and genetic data from populations in the region. This divergence of representations raises a sensitive question: how many details have been distorted over time to shape the figure of Jesus to the political and aesthetic interests of different eras? In certain passages of the text, Pilate seems to have an internal conflict between the role he played and the experience he lived. There are sentences in which he admits that he does not understand why that man bothered the priests so much. He says his crime seemed to be provoking dangerous thoughts in people who did not preach violence but challenged structures which did not incite revolt but weakened the authority of those who lived in fear. It was as if his mere presence threatened an entire system built to keep the people obedient. And Pilate, even without believing in the local prophecies, seems to have felt that there was something out of the ordinary in that figure who was handed over to him for judgment. Another passage that draws attention is when he reports the moment in which the prisoner was presented to the people. Pilate hoped that by showing Jesus injured, dressed in a cloak and crowned with thorns, the crowd would be moved. Instead, he heard applause for his humiliation. At this moment, the text abandons the descriptive tone and adopts a more personal register. Pilate writes that he has never felt so alone as he did at that moment, that there he understood the abyss that existed between him and the people he tried to govern. He, who had faced rebels, tried traitors and executed criminals, could not understand the hatred directed at a man who did not even defend himself. The letter also suggests that Pilate did not expect the episode to reach the proportions it did. By deciding on crucifixion, he believed he was resolving a local dispute. I had no idea that by authorizing that death, I would be sealing a symbol that would surpass empires, religions, and borders. Therefore, when he writes about the following days, there is a strange restlessness in his words. He mentions rumors that the body had disappeared, that some said they had seen him alive, And although he treats these reports with skepticism, he admits that something in him had changed since that day. The letter ends with an enigmatic phrase that, according to scholars, would have been modified or suppressed in many versions. If it was just one man, then the world will never know another like it. This sentence, released at the end of the text, does not conclude a reasoning, nor does it attempt to justify anything. It actually feels like a confession, as if, after everything, Pilate was no longer sure about what he saw, who he judged, or what it meant. And this doubt, silent and uncomfortable, is perhaps the most human and true trait that an ancient document can carry. The discomfort recorded in Pilate's words does not end with condemnation. The letter is not limited to reporting the facts, but echoes as the silent record of a conflicted conscience. The figure he describes did not pursue him with threats, but with silence. There was no eloquent speech that could be challenged, nor a concrete act that justified the punishment. What remained was the memory of a presence, the way that man looked at him, the absence of fear, the calm in the face of violence. Elements that, according to the author himself, made him wake up, so in the middle of the night, with the feeling of being watched by something that wouldn't go away. If you got this far, write hidden truth in the comments, so we know that you are part of those who are not satisfied with the superficial. This aspect of the narrative, however subjective it may seem, gains weight when compared with similar accounts from other historical figures indirectly involved. In the episode, soldiers, scribes, and even anonymous citizens mention, in apocryphal documents and fragments not officially recognized, the same impression. Jesus did not seem to be at a disadvantage. It wasn't arrogance nor madness. It was conviction, a silent certainty that this was not the last word, and this type of behavior, more than any accusation, destabilized the foundations of the trial. Roman politics was based on maintaining order and authority. Symbols were more powerful than weapons. A misinterpreted gesture could be considered treason, a prolonged silence, an affront. Therefore, when Pilate came across someone who seemed to accept death without resistance, he did not see submission, but something he could not define. Maybe that was why he tried so many times to shift responsibility to others. He sent the prisoner to Herod, suggested traditional release, tried to negotiate. No attempt had any effect. Religious leaders insisted on the maximum penalty, and the inflamed crowd turned the trial into a spectacle. In his accounts, Pilate does not deny his weakness. He admits that he gave in out of fear of the uprising, for fear of compromising his position with Rome. But it also insinuates something deeper, the fear that he was faced with a truth he could not control. The empire he represented prided itself on its rationality, its culture, and its military strength. Still, a single man with no weapons, no army, and no political allies managed to cause discomfort that no legion had ever caused. This confrontation between truth and power is what makes the letter so current. It reveals the abyss that exists between institutional justice and human truth. The trial of Jesus, described by Pilate, was not just a legal decision, but a mirror of the weaknesses of the system. The accused had no defenders. The process was manipulated, and the final decision served interests more than evidence. Pilate, in this scenario, is the portrait of all those who, throughout history, have found themselves faced with the dilemma between what is right and what is convenient. The figure of Jesus in the narrative of the letter is not imposed through force, but through the coherence between what he says and what he is. He doesn't contradict himself, he doesn't retreat, he doesn't accuse. And this unshakable integrity makes him unbearable for those who live on appearances. Pilate, when writing about him, does not show explicit admiration, but he also cannot hide the impact that meeting had. His hesitation, his attempts to avoid execution, and even the symbolic gesture of washing his hands do not seem like political strategies, but desperate attempts to remove a guilt that he already knew was inevitable. The strength of this card lies precisely in its vulnerability. Pilate does not present himself as a hero, nor as a villain. He's just a man placed in the eye of a storm he doesn't fully understand. His words, no matter how formal they were, carried cracks, small cracks through which a truth escapes that he himself seems unable to fully face. And perhaps that's why the text was hidden, forgotten, or rewritten, because doubt, when recorded on paper, becomes dangerous. It questions official versions, destabilizes dogmas, and gives voice to a conscience that prefers silence. In the following centuries, numerous copies appeared in monasteries, secret libraries, and private collections. None were officially included in the canons. The official explanation was the lack of proven authenticity, but the refusal to accept it may also be linked to the fact that it shows a side of Jesus that was not always interesting to preserve. A human, physical, detailed, real side. A man who walked, talked, and looked like any other, but who at the same time carried a type of truth that had no place in any court. And it is precisely this paradox that transforms the content of the letter into something so unsettling. This is not about proving or disproving miracles, but about facing the discomfort of having participated in the condemnation of someone who did not fit into any known category. Someone who, even without reacting, challenged fear, power, and lies. And Pilate, with all the resources of a governor, discovered that in the face of truth, power is nothing more than a fragile armor. The unrest caused by the letter was not limited to the figure of Pilate. Over the centuries, excerpts attributed to him have been found in contexts that suggest more than mere historical interest. The recurring appearance of these texts in archives and restricted collections points to a specific type of discomfort, the fear that the version recorded by someone who was not a disciple, prophet, or follower could influence the perception of Jesus in a more forceful way than the accounts considered sacred. A fear, perhaps, that a political opponent had seen more clearly what many tried to indoctrinate. During the medieval period, copies of the supposed letter circulated among Templars, Arab scholars, and even reformers who saw it as an unofficial confirmation of Jesus' uniqueness. Interestingly, the more religious authorities denied its validity, the more interest it aroused. The letter offered a direct image free of theological filters, an image that was not accompanied by miracles, dogmas, or spiritual interpretations, but by observations made by someone who saw himself before the man and not the myth. This detail is fundamental to understanding why the letter was so opposed. It humanizes Jesus in a raw yet serene way, and this makes it dangerous for any structure that depends on the distance between the sacred and the human. The existence of different versions of the letter further increased its complexity. Some copies include excerpts in which Pilate reports having dreamed about that man days before the trial, something that dialogues with ancient texts in which his wife also had visions. In other variations, he claims to have visited the site of the crucifixion days later and found the environment strangely calm, as if the world was holding its breath. There are also fragments that mention soldiers guarding the tomb and being overcome by a fear they could not explain, which echoes later rumors about the resurrection. Pilate does not claim to believe these reports, but records them, like someone who wants, even without admitting it, to understand what really happened after the verdict. The early church never endorsed these texts, and for understandable reasons. Christianity needed coherence, doctrine, structure. Texts that got out of control, no matter how legitimate they seemed, represented risks. Even more so when written by Roman hands or preserved by sects with their own interpretations of the faith. Truth in this case was not just a spiritual issue, but an institutional one. It was necessary to decide what should or should not be part of the official narrative. And Pilate, even though mentioned in the Gospels, could not occupy a role that aroused empathy or identification. He was the necessary villain, the symbol of cowardice. His possible humanity, expressed in the letter, would dismantle the moral contrast on which many speeches were raised. Despite this, the letter survived. And the reason he survived may have to do with his raw honesty. There is neither the rhetoric of the apostles nor the rigidity of the scribes. There is a man, educated to control, writing about something he has not been able to master. A story that deviates from heroism and also absolution. Pilate does not redeem himself in the text. He just exposes, like someone who needs to tell, even if too late, what they saw. This delivery, even if discreet, is a threat to any system that depends on narrative manipulation to sustain itself. The content of the letter by refusing clear definitions about Jesus, invites an uncomfortable reflection. What do we do when we come across something that does not fit into our categories? When someone cannot be framed as an enemy, nor as an ally, and yet confronts us with a truth that needs no words? Pilate seems to have experienced this dilemma, and his attempt to rationalize the incomprehensible was perhaps what led him to write, not for history, not for politics, but for himself, as if by recording what he felt, he could at least recognize that he was overcome by something he never understood. In the most complete copies, the letter ends with a paragraph that some scholars consider apocryphal, but which persists in several manuscript traditions. In it, Pilate writes that he does not fear the judgments of men nor the records of history, but only the day when he would have to face that look once again, not out of fear of punishment, but out of shame for having had the chance to do the right thing and choosing what was easy. The final sentence, although often cut, echoes with a sincerity that goes beyond any dogma. Between the noise of the world and its silence, I chose noise. And today, I understand that silence was the answer. This type of confession, although surrounded by uncertainty about its documentary veracity, carries a type of truth that goes beyond the need for proof, because there are moments in history when doubt is more powerful than certainty, when a silence carries more weight than 1,000 words. And the letter attributed to Pilate, true or not, continues to disturb precisely because it forces us to recognize that the trial of an innocent man did not end with his death. It repeats itself in disguise every day. And perhaps what is most disturbing is not the condemnation, but the fact that, like Pilate, most just watch and wash their hands. The existence of a document that presents Jesus from the perspective of a Roman politician who had nothing to gain from his exaltation raises an inevitable question. What if it is true? Not just in a historical sense, but symbolically. What if Pilate, the face of the empire who judged coldly and executed without hesitation, was precisely the one who saw, albeit briefly, something that the religious people of the time refused to accept? What if that look described in the letter, which disarmed him without making accusations, was more eloquent than any speech? This possibility is disturbing, not because it turns Pilate into a hero, but because it forces us to face the complexity of an event that, for convenience, has been simplified over time. History is usually told by victors and organized by those interested in maintaining certain meanings. But there are records like this one that escape official hands and survive due to their human burden. Pilate was neither a martyr nor a savior. He was an accomplice, yes, but he was also a witness. And perhaps this is the hardest part to admit. That guilt sometimes does not arise from evil, but from omission. That all it takes is a calculated choice, a gesture of silence for injustice to find its way. The gesture of washing his hands, although symbolic, was enough to immortalize him not as a man who killed, but as someone who saw and did not stop. This is where the letter bothers the most, because it does not present us with a tyrant, nor with an innocent person. It presents someone very similar to those who live behind the scenes of power, who hide in neutrality, who hand decisions over to the crowd to protect their position. Pilate did not hate Jesus. Maybe he even respected him. But he preferred to sacrifice the truth to preserve stability. This dilemma does not just belong to the past. It repeats itself today on different scales, every time someone recognizes their error but chooses to remain silent. The silence described in the letter is not the absence of sound. It's an uncomfortable presence, a type of look that reveals the contradictions of the other without raising your voice. Pilate saw a man who, despite being injured, did not lose his dignity. A man who, despite being betrayed, did not express resentment. This serenity disconcerted him because it could not be defeated. The letter reveals that deep down he knew he was facing someone who could not be erased by violence. And that was precisely what scared him. Because if authority is not capable of silencing a presence, then it is more fragile than it appears. Many centuries later, when scholars began to rediscover versions of this letter in forgotten libraries and ignored archives, the discomfort returned. Not because the content directly threatened dogmas, but because it revealed a type of truth that did not depend on religion. a truth about conscience, about the weight of choices, about the responsibility to see and not act. The letter is not a religious text, it's a mirror, and the reflection it offers is disconcerting. By describing Jesus as someone with an ordinary appearance but an unusual presence, Pilate challenges the later construction of a distant, almost mythical figure. The man he saw was bleeding, breathing, walking. It was real. And precisely because it was real, its silent firmness had so much impact. It was not the brilliance of the supernatural, but the absolute strength of someone who is at peace with themselves. This kind of firmness is rare, and therefore when it appears it causes extreme reactions. For some, admiration. For others, it is a threat.